I began my last video with a bit of a feint, pretending that I was going to talk about Armored Core 6. After doing that, I realized I want to talk about Armored Core 6, because Armored Core 6 fucking rocks. But I'm not just talking about Armored Core because it's cool. To paraphrase the video essayist Jacob Geller, it's absurd to claim that any From Software game is underrated. But given the massive shadow that Elden Ring has cast over the last couple years of video game discourse, I do think it might be fair to say that Armored Core 6 has been a bit underexamined. And I think that's a shame, because despite its relatively straightforward story, straightforward by contemporary FromSoft standards anyway, Armored Core 6 is a really rich text that is worth analyzing at length, even if it doesn't lend itself to hundreds of hours of extensive and speculative lore videos. This is not a lore video. Instead, what I'm going to do here is analyze Armored Core 6 in terms of a couple of contemporary theorizations of anarchist guerrilla resistance. Basically, I think AC6 is an anarchist game. And more than that, it's a game that clarifies certain concepts of anonymous resistance that contemporary anarchist philosophers have been developing. So, this is a short video that is going to answer 3 questions. 1. What is anarchism really? 2. What is the social problem that anarchism is responding to? And 3. In what way does the story and narrative structure of Armored Core 6, a story about resisting corporate exploitation of natural resources, model a specifically anarchist mode of war against the dominant order of things? And all 3 of these questions, we'll see, are bound up in the most important question that Armored Core 6 poses. What if fossil fuels were alive and they were my friend? So, on to our first question. What is anarchism? Well, you, the viewer, probably have some ideas in your head already. You probably know that anarchism is, basically, an ideology that rejects government on principle. It is very likely that the kindest opinion you hold of anarchism is that it is an idealistic philosophy which, in practice, leads only to wanton violence, because human beings are incapable of governing themselves without a disciplinary structure in place. As such, your mental image of anarchism is probably something like what I'm showing you now. Senseless violence, like the sadistic rampage that I'm forcing poor Nico Bellic to engage in. Here's where I need to immediately introduce a bit of a caveat. I'm going to talk straightforwardly and positively about anarchism in this video, but I myself am not really an anarchist. I'm kind of an anarchist, insofar as I believe that contemporary anarchist philosophy has something to offer left-wing political thinking today. Even the Marxists, I think, can learn something from the anarchists. But I also have to admit that I cannot fully get behind the notion that human beings ought not be governed. I think that in any kind of beautiful utopian leftist future to come, there will be some kind of governing entity that organizes human life. I think that's basically inevitable. And when I hear practical anarchists defend really existing autonomous zones or whatever, I just always think that it comes off as kind of cringe and unserious. Sorry. But I do think what anarchism offers, if not a practical view of the future, is a view of resistance, and really a view of being, of existence, that is really generative. That's the anarchism that I'm interested in. Not the future horizon of perpetually non-governed life, but what it means to resist being governed right now, and how that kind of resistance is getting us to fundamental truths about existence itself. So, to talk about what I find valuable in anarchism, we have to talk about philosophy for just a second. Can you manage it? Just like 2 minutes of philosophy, can you do it? I think you've got it in you. So, if anarchism isn't just a lack of government, what is it? As a provisional answer, I'm going to quote philosopher Catherine Malabou directly. Anarchism is first and foremost a fight against mechanisms of domination, which exceed the sphere of the state strictly speaking and affect all domains of life. public, private, collective, individual. Malibu defines domination as, quote, all forms of control that subject an individual or group to continuous subordination, unquote. While that definition of domination is helpful, on its own, I think it conjures a bit too easily images of totalitarian, military control. Domination goes deeper than that. Subordination and domination are absolutely endemic to day-to-day life. Right now, you're being dominated, and I'm being dominated, and not in a fun way. Well, maybe you are, in which case I don't know why you have this video on. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. Domination basically refers to an enforced social ordering. And often, this enforced social ordering is justified as either being for the betterment of all, or the best possible organization we could hope for. Or, most insidiously, that the social order reflects something essentially true about people. Anarchism is a rejection of that kind of logic. Let's go back to the beginning just for a second. The term anarchism derives from the Greek anarchia. Anarchia means without arche. Arche is a term which means both beginning and command. That double meaning, beginning and command, suggests something about how dominant social forms come to be dominant. They're enforced and they're taken to be natural. Let's think through an example. The way ideologies tend to work is that they claim that certain fundamental truths are baked into human existence. For example, transphobes claim that the gender binary of male-female is inscribed into human being, that gender is immutable, and that our historically and socially specific expressions of gender reflect something ontological. That is to say, they reflect something that is baked into being itself. So, binary expressions of gender, for conservatives, function as a kind of arche, a commanding principle that is taken to reflect something natural about the way human beings are. Now, hopefully this is obvious to you. The conservatives are wrong about gender, and normative expressions of heterosexuality and binary genders in the 21st century do not reflect a universal truth about humans and gender. And this is where anarchism comes in. To be without arche is to insist that there is not some kind of originary order which is fundamentally true about human beings. Anarchism insists that a state of anarchia lies beneath any possible arche, or to put it another way, that before any guiding principle or command, there is a more fundamental state of disorganized life, which does not have any kind of essential truth. The anarchist thesis is that there is a pure potential at the heart of existence, which is made subject again and again to commanding principles which place violent limits on what is possible. So, what the hell does this have to do with Armored Core 6, a game that is mostly about shooting robots until they blow up? Well, to answer that effectively, we need to quickly address our second question. What is the anarchist thesis responding to? As we've established, anarchism is first and foremost a fight against domination. But how are we being dominated? We started to think about this a couple minutes ago in abstract terms, but now we're going to think concretely. Again, Malibu offers a helpful summary. The crisis facing the world today is, quote, the combination of government violence and an infinite Uberization of life, unquote. What that means is that people are being dominated through direct force and an ever-increasing economic precarity, which is the product of, and maintained by, digital technology. And I think here is where it makes sense to start talking about Armored Core 6. If you haven't played it, Armored Core 6 is something like the 22nd game in the Armored Core series, which has been going since 1997. Armored Core 6 is a complete plot reboot, one among many that have happened in the series' history. That means that Armored Core 6, despite the number on its title, is entirely self-contained. If you jumped into the series here, like I did, you're not missing anything. Despite having a relatively straightforward narrative structure compared to From Software's other games, such as Dark Souls and Elden Ring, AC6 still deploys a similarly minimalist approach to exposition and character. So the plot summary that follows is still somewhat speculative. Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon, takes place in the far future, where a spacefaring humanity fights it out over a particularly potent fuel source called coral. You play as a human who has received physical augmentations which allow your player character to pilot advanced combat mechs called armored cores. Your player character arrives on the planet Rubicon, where they engage in work as an independent mercenary in the employ of a handler named Walter. Walter serves as your character's talent agent, if you will, getting you jobs engaging in combat missions for the various factions which are fighting for control of the coral, which is being siphoned from the planet. These factions are primarily large corporate conglomerates whose business at least partially entails weapon design and manufacturing. You also fight for the local resistance movement, the Rubicon Liberation Front, whenever they can scrape together enough cash to hire you. In the first several acts of the game, you're an independent contractor playing all sides of the conflict. The Corp Arquebus will hire you to fight the Corp Balaam, and then in the next mission, Balaam will hire you to fight Arquebus, knowing full well that it was you that fucked them up last time. Eventually, the Corp's War for the Coral leads the Planetary Closure Administration, a heavily militarized government force, to intervene in the conflict in an attempt to kick all of the Corps and mercenaries off of the planet. In response, the corporations temporarily join forces to resist the PCA so that their own economic war can be resumed without outside intervention. At this point, we're only about halfway through the plot. However, what I want you to get from the story so far is that Malibu's description of our contemporary form of domination, government violence, and the uberization of life is not far off from the state of things in Armored Core 6. AC-6 tells the story of corporations engaging in all-out war with government regulatory forces, and with each other, employing amoral independent contractors, such as the player character, as combatants in a violent economic struggle. AC-6 tells the story of a humanity which is hyper-militarized but also hyper-economized, where corporate and government violence creates the conditions for the entrepreneurial spirit of Armored Core pilots like yourself to flourish. The game's old-fashioned, short mission structure and mission select screen are an expression of how the action in this game is a form of labor. Each mission is like a different Uber passenger for your player character to pick up. For the first half or so of Armored Core 6, this situation is all you have to go on. If you have a reason for being on Rubicon that isn't just making some money, you don't know what it is. As the game proceeds, it is slowly unveiled that your handler, Walter, has a hidden mission on Rubicon. It is revealed that Walter was formerly a scientist in the employ of an organization called the Institute, a group dedicated to extracting and studying coral, who also appear to have pioneered the use of coral as fuel. Walter's research also directly contributed to what he calls
the Carnival of Horrors,
including the process of genetic augmentation that Armored Core pilots undergo. So, a colleague of Walter's burned the Institute's coral reserve, destroying the Institute's research infrastructure and devastating planet Rubicon. Walter's plan is to finish the job, to use you as an instrument to burn the rest of the coral, thereby reversing the carnival of horrors that Walter's research unleashed. Corporate warfare, Armored Core pilot surgeries, all of it would go up in flames alongside the coral. To pull this off, Walter needs you to be able to access an underground facility where the Institute was formerly based. And to do that, he needs you to gain the corporation's trust. A careful viewer may have noticed we're still on question 2. That is, we're still answering the question, what is the social problem that anarchism is responding to? We've established that it's domination, which takes the form of a mixture of violent repression and economic precarization. But let's add one more important wrinkle. Catherine Malibu argues that, quote, the anarchist critique of domination echoes the critique of representation, unquote. The idea here being that to be represented within an order of power is a necessary step in being dominated. To be represented is to be legible to the social order, and the instant you are legible, you are able to be a target of control. To be clear, we're not really thinking about media representations here. We're thinking about legibility to dominant political and social institutions. The anarchist theorist Andrew Culp provides a helpful explanation of the downside of this kind of representation through an explanation of surveillance. We live in a surveillance society. Our internet history is tracked. Our keystrokes are tracked. Our movement is tracked. The manual checking of my passport when I fly out of the country has been replaced, largely, with facial recognition technology. We are, whether we like it or not, data creation machines. And we can think of this as a kind of representation. That when we are surveilled by digital technology, we are producing representations of ourselves within technological infrastructures that make us legible to political and economic institutions. Armored Core 6 actually provides us with a fantasy version of this kind of representation. In AC6, there is an arena where you can fight simulated battles against other Armored Core pilots. The digital ghosts that you fight are produced from a synthesis of data taken from that pilot's real-world combat data, which has been fed into an AI program called AllMind. The way in which AllMind constructs models of Armored Core pilots that are in their behavior indistinguishable from the behavior of the real pilots reflects what Andrew Culp says is the main purpose behind digital surveillance: prediction. AllMind is able to predict accurately how a pilot will behave. Digital surveillance and data collection allows companies and institutions to create models of behavior that can predict human action in the real world too, and then that action can be shaped using these predictive models. YouTube algorithms are a famous example. If the recommendation algorithm brought you to this video, the odds are that you already watch a lot of video game essayist content, and YouTube delivered my video to you to keep your attention on their platform, so they can either serve you ads or justify your ongoing YouTube Premium subscription. Now that's just one small way that digital surveillance functions as a technology of domination, though. The goal of our surveillance society is to modulate individual behaviors to create reliably obedient and docile subjects, to colonize the future, as Culp puts it, to ensure that the status quo of civil society is maintained. And look, if you're happy with the status quo, I'm not going to convince you not to be in this video. But the official stance of this channel is that genocidal war overseas, ongoing economic precarization, racist riots in the UK, and the ongoing crackdown on the rights of women and LGBT peoples in the United States indicates that our status quo is kind of fucked. You're either with me or you're not on that. For the sake of argument, let's say you are, and that you want to resist the status quo. How do you do that in a society of total digital surveillance? Andrew Culp's answer is that you find methods of becoming imperceptible, that you engage in methods of resistance which are anonymous, authorless, that you act and then withdraw from the public eye before you can be represented as a collection of data points or an ideology. The anarchist rejection of representation, therefore, is an act of evading power, of making yourself illegible to institutions of domination. My problem with Culp's argument is that, even after reading the whole book that the argument comes from, this form of anonymous, illegible resistance feels nebulous and temporary. Culp walks us through examples of real anonymous collectives and acts of sabotage that have not ultimately altered very much of our reality. And this is where Armored Core 6 steps in as a speculative example of anonymous resistance that, despite being completely fictional, feels like something new and something worth articulating. Earlier, I referred to your avatar in AC6 as simply the player character. That's because your character in Armored Core 6 doesn't have a name. They have several. Handler Walter calls your character by their numerical designation, 621.
Got a job for you, 621.
Walter's allies, Carla and her AI partner Chatty, call you Tourist.
You're the best, Chatty. You too, Tourist.
Balaam operatives call you Gun 13.
Gun 13, roll out that fancy gizmo that Archibus paid the big bucks for.
Archibus soldier and secret Rubicon Liberation Front operative V4 Rusty calls you Buddy.
So, buddy, who needs you?
Air, the voice of the choral that only you can hear riding along in your mind, calls you Raven.
Thank you for doing this for me, Raven.
This last designation is the most important, and not just because it's a reference to earlier games in the series. Raven is a stolen designation. It is an ID tag that you extract from a downed AC in the game's very first mission. Raven is an independent mercenary license, which is required to authenticate an AC pilot's work-ready status.
Scavenge the AC wrecks ahead and find a valid mercenary license.
It is the form of identification that allows you and Walter to respond to open calls from the corporations for independent contractors.
Got a job for you, 621. It's an open call from the Archibus Group, one of the extraplanetary corporate forces.
It is an assumed identity which grants Walter and the player character access to the war being waged over Rubicon's most valuable resource, the coral. And therefore, the phony identification Raven gives you and Walter access to the levers of power that determine the fate of Rubicon. But what separates this kind of anonymity from the anonymity of most video game protagonists? While most video game protagonists have names and often some kind of backstory, they often feel anonymous too. Can you honestly tell me that you feel like a 24-year-old MIT grad when you play Half-Life? Do you not just feel like a gun on wheels? In an analysis of the bartending sim and visual novel Valhalla, media studies scholar Cameron Kunzelman compellingly argues that he identifies not with the game's main character, but with the labor process that both he and the main character are engaging in. In other words, Kunzelman isn't embodying the person, but the process of manipulating the drink-making machine that both he and she share. Kunzelman expands this out into a general theory of how video games work. When you play a game, you're not taking on the role of a character, but instead your behavior is modified to mirror the action that the character is engaging in. Now, you may come to care for your character emotionally as a kind of secondary attachment, but first, you get absorbed into the mechanisms of gameplay. Put another way, you're not identifying with a person, but with a process. And in that way, there's a certain anonymity built into every video game, because you're actually being made to identify first with a set of procedures before you identify with or care about your character. The fact that there is no functional difference between the real battles and the simulated battles in Armored Core 6 kinda reflects this. Whether real or digital, the experience of fighting another Armored Core is exactly the same. So for me, what makes the anonymity of 621/Raven/Turris/Gun13/Buddy is the element of trickery. Basically, there is no stable identity that is attached to the process of piloting the Armored Core, which is the thing you really identify with as the player character. Instead, there is a proliferation of identities that obscures your player character from ever truly being known by any other entity. This is how your character resists legibility, not by evading the corpse in the PCA altogether, but by making themselves known through an alias that obscures their actual intentions. And it is through that veiled legibility, a form of making yourself known to the corpse while actually concealing yourself from them, that you become a saboteur. The story of Armored Core 6 feels aimless for much of its runtime, and that's because you spend the first half of the game immersing yourself in the machinations of power that determine life on Rubicon. You help the corporations fight each other, and eventually the PCA, so you can gain access to Institute City, which has the equipment necessary to enact Walter's plan and burn the coral. The only overarching narrative direction in the game's first half comes from meeting Air. Air is a voice of the coral. What that means is a little unclear, but we can conclude that the coral, this natural resource of Rubicon, is sentient, a flow of voices that can manifest themselves to humans in extraordinary circumstances. Air is one manifestation of the coral. As she refers to herself,
I am but a single wave, born from the coral tide. A Rubiconian without a body.
Air provides the game with its narrative trajectory in the first half by functioning as the game's moral center, by making Rubicon known to you as a place and not merely as a battleground.
This outing has made you think about Rubicon's past or the nature of coral. Then it was all worth it.
More than that, Air reinforces the anarchist anonymity that your player character already embodies. You are an empty vessel with a stolen name. Air is the entity that fills the vessel, a being that is contained within you and known only to you. Air is fully withdrawn from the fight for Rubicon, illegible to everyone but you. But in her state of withdrawal, she is also a moral agent, transforming your player character from within. Armored Core 6 has 3 endings. In one of them, you side with Walter and burn the coral, igniting Rubicon and most of the known galaxy with it. In the other 2, you side with Air. No matter which ending you pick, much of the overall playthrough is the same. You follow the flow of power to Institute City, where you discover the reservoir of coral that Walter wants to burn. But then you make a choice. Do you burn the coral, like Walter wants, killing Air and her family? Or do you save the coral, keeping open the possibility that humanity and the coral may one day live together harmoniously? In some ways, these two endings are identical. Both choices are pursued in direct opposition to the corporations and leave the corporate infrastructure and leadership on Rubicon absolutely devastated. It's just that one ends with the galaxy burning, ending the war for the coral at all costs, and one doesn't. Nonetheless, the choice to side with Air is the properly anarchist choice, in my opinion. Armored Core 6 models an anarchist mode of resistance by putting you in control of a player character who is doubly eligible to dominant forms of power, through the deceptive use of a stolen alias, and through the ontological imperceptibility of Air's voice to others. The game tells a story where you use that eligibility to infiltrate institutions and networks of power relations, until you gain access to a central node of that network that you can sabotage, bringing the whole structure of power crumbling down. But that power crumbles whether or not you pick Walter or Air. So why is Air the anarchist choice? Well, it's because Air, in being a voice without a body, in being a small part of a form of life that works in flows of waves rather than individual bodies, is ironically the embodiment of anarchism's claims about being. Air is, in some fundamental way, unknowable. Air only ever gains a body in the ending where you side with Walter, where Air takes over an armored core to fight you. But, in her own words, she has no body. She is a voice without a subject. She is radically outside of the bounds of humanity, and therefore represents an originary, anarchic possibility. And that unknowability makes her the perfect guerrilla. Anarchist guerrilla resistance, according to Andrew Culp, is a form of resistance that captures a sentiment while not allowing itself to become represented in a specific identity. This is a long quote, but it's worth reading in full. The offensive use of camouflage orients politics away from the spectacle, which limits politics to the space of appearance, and toward the underground movement of forces not descendant from the state. The guerrilla initiates this shift by establishing an indistinguishability between themselves and everyone else. Once the guerrilla becomes imperceptible, actions are no longer viewed as the actions of a crank, madman, or criminal against the public, but as the concrete expression of sentiments held by many. Every act signs itself, claiming responsibility for itself through its particular how and through its specific meaning in situation, rendering it immediately discernible. This underground force thus exposes itself to political scrutiny, even when hiding its source. The guerrilla therefore lives as the expression of others or dies as a solitary individual, which is to say that the guerrilla renounces the notion of the revolutionary subject and instead gives force to the non-subject as it's becoming revolutionary. In other words, guerrilla sabotage expresses a will that is never allowed to be the utterance of one sole subject who can be dismissed as a lone lunatic. Instead, anonymous action, in being anonymous, becomes the expression of a collective idea. I can't help but feel that both of Air's endings, named Liberator of Rubicon and Alia Iacta Est, are themselves representations of this kind of guerrilla action. Air is never identified by the corpse. Air is never even identified by the faction that wants to burn Rubicon to stop the war over its resources. Walter only becomes aware of Air when he returns to fight you on the corp's behalf after being warped, tortured, and re-educated by the corporations. Resisting his re-education before he dies, he remarks that he has begun to hear the voice of the coral, recognizing that the pilot, your character, has found a new form of camaraderie.
Look at you, 621. You found a friend.
It is in the camaraderie and solidarity with Air that an anarchist resistance to domination is articulated. The pilot an heir will into existence something that isn't endless economic warfare or complete destruction. The two of you embody an illegible, anonymous will of a collective being that was able to express itself only on the condition of its imperceptibility. The two of you enact a resistance that promises a new form of life, where humanity and the flowing currents of sentient coral can intermingle and coexist in peace. This new form of life would be without precedent, a break with the commanding principles of individual embodiment and economically mandated war that guide human beings. And in that break, in that rejection of that commanding principle, lies anarchism.
I know Walter feared a collapse. But I promise you, there's another way.